This is Cybersecurity for Everyone. I'm Dr. Charles Harry. We've been talking about hacking effects or the impacts that threat actors have on a variety of networks and specific devices. And we talked last time about how those effects can be thought of or framed. In this particular module, I want to talk about primary effects. If you recall last time, we talked about a variety of different effects, primary, secondary, and second order effects. And primary effects are the impacts on specific IT systems. And it's important to remember that when we think about effects, that each category can be measured differently. So primary effects, again, are the direct impacts on targeted devices. A cyber event is the result of a series of actions that a threat actor will take to directly affect targeted devices. Remember, they're going through that hacking process, and at the end of it, they want to do something. And so that something could be something as simple as compromising data, or what we call the confidentiality. So examples of this might be spear phishing or SQL injection attacks on databases. It could be that data is being manipulated or going after the integrity of those devices and that data. So doing things like recording changes to records in a database or modifying code in a specific application. It could also be that those devices are made inoperable or less effective, what we also call accessibility. And examples of that might be ransomware attacks or data wipers. So it's important to think of primary effects in a broader category. And what we use is the term called taxonomy. And our taxonomy of end effect is really about how to think about and break up and categorize all the different possible end effects that can be achieved from a cyber event. So in our case, we may want to think about disruptive events. These are cyber events that actually make inoperable or make less effective specific devices. We may also want to think of exploitive events where data is actually stolen from a variety of different devices. So let's first talk about disruptive events. So what is a disruptive event? Well, disruptive events, or the effects that disruptive attacks have, are all about making devices or the applications less effective, or frankly not work at all. And there really are 5 broad categories we can think about. So one category we might call message manipulation, and this would be a cyber event that really interferes with a victim's ability to accurately present or communicate its message to its user or customer base. And so examples of this might include the hijacking of social media accounts like Facebook or Instagram, or defacing a company website. And we see examples of this all the time where hackers gain access to, let's say, a celebrity's Instagram page, and they start making really bad comments on it. That would be an example of a message manipulation attack. So external denial of service is also a disruptive event, and that's really where a threat actor is executing a cyber attack from devices outside the target organization's network, right? And an example of this would be what's called the distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS attack. Again, this is a very common attack that we see, and the goal of the particular threat actor is to make inoperable or to slow down some of the devices that are connected on the internet to, in essence, either extort money, or sometimes it's just really as a broad set of interests that they have. There's also what we would call an internal denial of service attack, where threat actors are operating now inside the network, and they're degrading or denying access to other internal systems. So if I have access to a router and I now reset that router to factory settings and it no longer works, then all those packets that are traversing that network, going back and forth, no longer can get to their destination, and therefore there's a denial of service. But it's happening inside the network, and that is what makes it different than a DDoS attack, where threat actors control infrastructure outside your network and are trying to overwhelm or flood your external internet connected device. We can also think of some category called data attack, where this is a cyber event that manipulates, destroys, or encrypts data in a victim's network. And so a good example of this would be ransomware or data wiper attacks, where people have gone, or threat actors have gained access to a specific system and now delete the contents of a hard drive entirely, or they encrypt it so that you can't gain access to that data. And finally, they're what we would call physical attack. So these are cyber events that manipulate, degrade, or destroy physical systems. And the idea is that an attack, something on like a supervisory control and data acquisition system, or what we call a SCADA system, that actually interfaces with physical devices, sensors, valves, these types of things, what we often call operational technology. If a cyber event manipulates, degrades, or destroys the actual physical system because they turn the valve the wrong way and suddenly a lot of steam pressure builds up and it blows something up, that's what we would call a physical attack. And we've seen examples of this type of disruptive cyber event occur throughout the world. So we've seen instances in the case of Ukraine where power attacks were conducted against the electrical grid. We've also seen the same attack occur in other places of the world. So primary effects, right? They have these direct impacts on targeted devices. And we just talked about disruptive attacks, but attacks can also be exploitive in nature. So what is an exploitive end effect? Well, there are 5 categories of exploitive effect. And exploitation is all about taking advantage of the data on those systems. So we're not talking about disrupting the operations of the particular computer device or network. What we're talking about is stealing data. And so you can steal data in a couple of different areas. So the first is exploitation of sensor information. So these are cyber events that result in the loss of data from a peripheral device, like a credit card reader, or even an automobile or smart light bulb. And so an example of this might be the compromise of data, credit card data, from what's called a point of sale system. These are those card readers when you go in to buy a cup of coffee or buy a shirt. You usually swipe your card into a machine. So threat actors can gain access to those machines and steal that credit card data. And we would classify that as an exploitation of sensor end effect. Now there's also what we would call exploitation of end host. And so these are cyber events that steal data stored on a user's desktop computer, laptops, or even mobile device. And there are very common examples of these types of attack include things called spear phishing, where you get that email from the Nigerian prince or from whoever where they want you to click on a link. And when you click on that link, it runs the exploit code and it goes through that first set of processes, which is part of the delivery process, exploitation, everything that we talked about in the hacking process eventually leads to the exploitation of that end host. And the goal is to steal data stored on that user's desktop computer, laptop, or mobile device. There's exploitation of network infrastructure. And in this case, the cyber event is really attempting to compromise data through direct access to the networking equipment. These include things like routers and switches and modems. And the idea is that if I gain access to that infrastructure, then I can steal data and understand more broadly how your network is configured. And so we see different types of attacks, including the ability to brute force their way into a particular piece of network equipment by doing what's called cracking of a password. So I'm able to, let's say, take an encrypted version of that password, break it, figure out and interpret what the plain text is, and actually log into that network device. So exploitive events or exploitive effects can also include things like exploitation of an application server. And this is where a cyber event basically exploits the misconfiguration or vulnerability of a particular server-side operation system or an application itself, like a database. And so an example of this would be a SQL injection attack, where a user is taking advantage of a poorly configured application, and they're in essence tricking the database and the application to spit out its contents. And we see examples of SQL injection attacks occur almost every day. And so exploitation of data in transit is our final category. And these are cyber events where data is compromised while in transit. And so if you're able to get in the middle of the movement of packets from that point of sale system, that card reader, and the database where they're stored, and you're able to read them while they're moving, that's an exploitation of data in transit. And so hopefully what you start to see here is there's lots of different ways I can either acquire information from your network, or there are ways that I can disrupt you. So hacking generates these kind of initial primary effects, which can lead to additional consequences. And so a threat actor who has their own motivations is basically engaging in the hacking process against one or many machines in your network. And when they finally get to the place they want to be, they take action on target. Right? They're actually doing something. And when they do that, they generate a cyber event. And that cyber event can be both disruptive in nature, right? So it can, fall into any one of these 5 categories, or it can be exploitive in nature, where they're actually stealing data. And so those primary events are all generated by this kind of motivation that the threat actors have. However, those actions can also generate secondary impacts on the human processes they support, right? So not all cyber events are the same. So let me give you 2 different examples of what I mean. The first is defacement of a company website. And the second is ransomware on the assembly line in that same organization. In the first example, where they deface a website, there's some content that's modified, files are quickly restored, it only takes about 30 minutes for them to come back online. There's no impact to the manufacturing capability. And the cyber attack is really focused primarily on that one web server. And there really is no significant financial loss for the company because, they haven't stopped the ability to make their product. In the second example, where ransomware is deployed on the actual assembly line on the devices that control that assembly line, the devices that are managing that assembly line are made completely inoperable for 72 hours. So right there, you see a big difference. In the first event, we only had a 30-minute disruption. Now we're talking about 72 hours. But there's no manufacturing that's able to take place in this second example, right? And there's significant operational disruption, which leads to large-scale financial losses while the systems are restored. So customer concerns also start to emerge because of these supply chains. And so what are some of the takeaways? Cyber attacks can generate primary effects. And primary effects are broadly defined to be disruptive or exploitive in nature. And categorizing those primary end effects and understanding that there can be additional secondary impacts is useful in assessing the overall severity of one cyber event from another. Next time, we'll talk about secondary effects. I hope to see you next time.